this opportunity to be back in Nashville again. So I wrote 2 books. One is going to be what I'll be speaking about tonight. It's called The Astrological Karma of the USA. And before we get to more of the current events of what's going on astrologically in relationship to the United States and to the new presidency, I just want to kind of segue into where we've been recently in the past. What inspired me to write this book was the fact that I had a lecture set up in Eugene, Oregon for the evening of September 12th, 2001. Which turned out to be a pretty heavy night for a lecture. And that was when I decided to look at the astrology chart of the United States, which I had never really seen before because I'm usually sorting out people and not countries. But on that night, I had to see what was going on. And I was pretty amazed to see what I could see right away. And then I got the inspiration to come back and write the book. Now, the United States, we use July 4th, 1776, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the Declaration of Independence, as a symbolic birth of the United States. It's like anything that has a birth, time, and place, you can do a chart. You can do a chart for a corporation, you can do a chart for a marriage. And this gives the United States the sun in Cancer. And that's who we really are, that's our soul essence, that's the biggest thing in the sky. Be this caring, nurturing, mothering being, breadbasket to the world, the best symbol of which to me is the Statue of Liberty. The female goddess at the edge of the sea in the poem at the base that says, "Send me your poor huddled masses to these shores to create a new life." And that's what we're supposed to be about. Now, we think we are Sagittarius. See, I should explain. The Master Hilarion, which is one of my sources of information astrologically. I work with 2 schools of astrology. One is a psychological approach. I studied with a well-known author named Liz Green, who's both an astrologer and a Jungian analyst. But I also work with a body of information that was, quote, channeled from an ascended master, the Master Hilarion. And his information... How do you spell that? Hilarion. And his information is very much a karmic astrology, where he just lays out what are the lessons the soul agreed to work on and grow through in this lifetime. And he does not pull any punches. He just talks the truth. I often share how I got a hold of the information myself 1 month after my divorce. And I was already having to be honest with myself. And it felt like it nailed me to the wall. It was good. It made me cop and go, yep, this is my stuff. I promise to try to do better, and I'll stop blaming life for other people for it. Of course, I could look at my ex-wife's chart and go, I told you so. So Hilarion says a lot of people's challenge is to get back in touch with their sun sign. Because that's who you really are. That's the biggest thing in the sky. That's your soul essence. And other factors in the chart can obscure that. For example, the rising sign, the sign on the eastern horizon when you're born, that's your self-image, the way you tend to see yourself. The midheaven, what's straight up when you're born, that's the way you present yourself to the world. And the moon and aspects to the moon is the general influence of your reflected upon you in childhood. My opening line on a chart is always the same. I'll use my own chart as an example. I would say to myself, you are a Libra, you think you're a Scorpio, you pretend you're a Virgo, and in your childhood you had to be a Cancer. Sun rising midheaven and mid. Well, the United States thinks it is Sagittarius. We have Sagittarius rising. So that's our self-image, the way we see ourselves. And Sagittarius rising has some very positive qualities. It gives a love of adventure and travel, and that's why Americans created cars and planes and landed on the moon. And it creates a youthful optimism and enthusiasm, that American can-do spirit. But, according to Hilarion, it also gives a self-image of oneself as being honest, upright, and morally strong. whether true or not. Does that sound like us a little bit? We're always the good guys, no matter what. I mean, sometimes we really are the good guys, but even when we're not, we think we are. We always have the white hats. Well, the planet Pluto, which I still consider a planet, the planet of complete transformation, which you have no choice to try to avoid it, is to invite disaster, was less than 1 degree from that Sagittarian self-image on September 11th. For the first time in history. It took from 1776 until the year 2000 to reach there. That's chapter 1 in my book, and it goes on from there. And Pluto will be in our first house of self-image until 2018. In that time period, the way we see ourselves is going to go through and is going through complete death, rebirth, transformation. See, the purpose of Pluto is to really force you to look deep within yourself. And what are your deepest motives and intentions? Is it love or is it fear? The thing about 9/11 that I often share is, you know, when somebody is laying a really heavy trip on me, and I can see that where they are coming from is very irrational and dysfunctional, I can nonetheless go inside myself and go, okay, God, I see where this guy is coming from. But nonetheless, why is this happening to me? I mean, what's in this for me? And that's what a large portion of Americans did start doing after 9/11. I mean, why are we such a good hook for this much hatred? You know, what is this? What are we supposed to learn from this? The trouble is, another portion of Americans, instead of submitting to that Plutonian introspection, have instead tried to become Plutonian and totally control and manipulate and destroy all appeared enemies and use secret, underhand, you know, torturous means to do so. Like Dick Cheney said, we might have to walk on the dark side. This is Pluto. He has Sun squared. But it's not a good idea to take over the power of a god. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the U.S. chart, but I just want to hit some of the high points of what we've been dealing with in order to bring us into the present and to the future. I did make a prediction in the first edition of my book. This is the second edition. The first edition came out in the spring of 2002, and I wrote it in the winter of 2001-2002. And at that time, nobody was talking at all about Iraq. Maybe Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were, but you know, we were just mopping up Afghanistan. But I could see that between 2003 and 2006, that we would be dealing with the exact same lessons that we were dealing with during the time of the war in Vietnam. As soon as they started talking about Iraq, I said, oh no, if they go to war in Iraq, it will be just like Vietnam. Sometimes you hate to be right. What I was looking at is we have Mars in the 7th house, the Libra house of partnership, marriage, relationships. We have 4 planets there, so that's where a lot of our curriculum is. Now Venus and Jupiter there, in an individual's chart, that would be a very positive indicator of an eventual happy marriage or partnership relationship. But Mars is at the beginning, and so it's stronger. It's not a good place for Mars. Valerian says that's where you tend to experience conflict and aggression in your relationships. There's a tendency to rush into battle when opposed. And it's square to Neptune. And we have Neptune in both positive and difficult aspects. I always tell my clients, you see these orange and red lines? We have a great phrase for those in astrology. We call them a great opportunity for growth. I like what my friend in New Jersey calls them. She calls them an AFGO, another effing growth opportunity. New Jersey style metaphysics. But it's true, no pain, no gain. Without some tension, you might be flexible and harmonious, but not having a real strength. It's only tension until you've healed and integrated it within yourself. And then it becomes strength or wisdom you can use to help other people with similar problems. Well, Neptune in positive aspect is unconditional love, compassion, spirituality, creativity, imagination, and so forth. But Neptune in difficult aspect is illusion, confusion, delusion, victimhood, and martyrdom. And that squares that Mars feistiness. In the 1960s, Pluto was conjuncting to Neptune, which on the one hand was all of that eruption of spiritual consciousness and people altering their consciousness through different means, and the best music there ever was, and I went to Woodstock. But it was squaring Mars. That was Vietnam. Undermining this martial way of dealing with relationships, where you just send in the Marines. Well, in 2003, Pluto, still moving through the first house of self-image, moved into an opposition to Mars and a square to Neptune. So everything that was hitting during Vietnam is hitting again. Now, you can probably tell by now that my personal politics are a little bit left of center. I confess. In full disclosure, I voted for Barack Obama. It's true. But I'm a Libra, and I do try to be fair and look at both sides. And the fact is, if this was an individual with this chart, I would say to them, you need to heal and integrate this Mars-Neptune tension. Now, for us, until we heal and integrate both ends of a difficult aspect, the tendency is to project one end or another on somebody else. Which to me will explain all those relationships that afterwards you look back on and go, why did I ever get with somebody like that? And it's these denied parts of ourselves. Because the unconscious is always trying to become conscious, so it sets things up so you get conscious of who you are. Now, a nation might do some of that kind of projecting. What seems to be more the case, somebody get me a glass of water. Sure. What seems to be more the case is that the nation itself divides itself into these different factions. Now, looking at Mars-Neptune in the 1960s, well, that would be hawks and doves. And, you know, I'm definitely, at that time and even now, more of a dove than a hawk. But again, I can sense how this is something that needs to be healed and integrated. Where you can't do just Mars with no Neptune, with no compassion, no sensitivity to the reality of the people that you're dealing with. In Vietnam, there was a famous statement where they said, we had to destroy the village in order to save it. Now, this is Mars with no Neptune. But by the same token, you can't do just Neptune without an occasional need for Mars, where it has to be healed and integrated. Now, I was able to put in my book an interesting example of how this Mars-Neptune tension in the American experience of itself could have been healed and integrated at the end of the Cold War. Because I have a friend who is a colonel in the Army, and he worked at the Pentagon. And at the end of the Cold War, he submitted a proposal to the top brass of the military to transform the role and usage of the military, to maintain military readiness and training, but to make it into a humanitarian force for peace. To go into places where there is ecological disasters or natural cataclysms or famine or plant trees. And of course the martial elements of the military were so intimidated by his Neptunian suggestion that it became, that they totally refused it, and the atmosphere became so horrible for him he had to take early retirement.
Was he Aquarius?
I don't remember. He may well have been. Now, But just imagine if they had transformed the role and usage of the military back in 1992. Who knows where we would have been on September 11th, 2001. Interesting fact, the Mars end of this square is a degree earlier than the Neptune. In the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003 was Pluto, exact opposite to the Mars. The last heavy transit that hit the U.S. chart in 2004 was in December of 2004. And it was Pluto finally moving into an exact square to the Neptune. 6 days later, the American Navy was sent across the Neptunian Sea in the greatest mission of humanitarian salvation and outreach in the history of the planet, in the aftermath of the tsunami in the Indian Ocean. So for that 1 month, they were like forced into the vision that my friend had for the American military. And then we went back to Mars. Now, I tell my clients that the planets hit, and it's always to learn a lesson. And we can learn the lesson gracefully, or we can learn it kicking and screaming. As they say, pain is necessary, suffering is optional. And obviously, by going to war in Iraq, we kind of chose more of a kicking and screaming type way to deal with this lesson. But I can also acknowledge and honor that we are also being forced to deal with this lesson. Like when they went into Baghdad in the beginning, it was in tanks with heavy metal music. And it was just Mars energy. Now the military is learning how to actually talk to the people that they're dealing with in these countries and develop some Neptunian sensitivity and compassion to the reality that people are dealing with. I mean, we're kind of being forced to deal with this. Now, you'll see that the moon is in positive aspect to that. And this brings us into a theme that is part of current events. The moon and aspects to the moon is the influence of your childhood reflected onto you. I have a whole chapter in the book called The Birth and Early Life of the United States of America. Because to me, this moon in Aquarius, in positive aspect, is the Aquarian idealism this country was founded on. Freedom of the rights of the individual, and all men are created equal. That's total Aquarian visionary energy. Aquarius shows up in all the charts of the founders. Jefferson had Aquarius rising, Washington Aquarius midheaven, Benjamin Franklin, Mercury in Aquarius. Thomas Paine, who it is said the revolution owed as much to the pen of Paine as it did to the sword of Washington. Manly P. Hall believes that Thomas Paine actually wrote the Declaration of Independence, as a lot of his theological concepts, like nature's God. And that Jefferson and Madison just did minor editing. Thomas Paine was an Aquarius with 4 planets conjunct in Aquarius. Total Aquarian visionary. And to the true Aquarian visionaries in the founding of the United States, this new democracy based on the freedoms of the rights of the individual and equality and brotherhood was something that was to be for the whole world. Not just for this one country to get rich and powerful and dominate everybody else. Now, there are various reasons why the United States is continually challenged at being able to live up to the full potential of its being and its nature. You know, we got some red and orange lines in this chart. And I'm not going to go through it all tonight because I want to get to more current events. But there are 2 major astrological events which took place this year. Both affecting the United States specifically. One is that the planet Pluto moved into the sign of Capricorn. Now Pluto stays in the same sign for a long time. been in the sign of Sagittarius since 1995. It will be in Capricorn until 2024. And Pluto indicates where the collective transformation and death rebirth is going on. Now, as I said, Pluto in Sagittarius on September 11th was on our self-image. The Sagittarius is also a sign of philosophy, religion, belief system. And it's been forcing people to go much deeper into their belief systems. And it's forced a lot of people to look for meaning and purpose of life in traditions outside of their traditional belief systems, giving rise to bookstores like Mystic Journeys. It's also forced people to go into more fundamentalist versions of their traditional belief systems. The shadow side of Sagittarius is fanaticism. We've seen lots of that since 1995. It's to be noted that when Pluto just dipped into Sagittarius for 1 month and then went back into Scorpio before going in for good was April of 1995 when the federal building was blown up in Oklahoma City. Welcome to Pluto and Sagittarius. So, moving into Capricorn, to understand the significance of a planet in a sign or the house associated with that sign, in the system of astrology that I work with, this channeled from the Master Valerian, it's really useful to see what Valerian says about the sun in that sign, because that's where he really sets the theme of what that sign is about. So this is what Valerian says about having the sun in Capricorn. Now, if anyone here is a Capricorn, I just want to say that you are clearly one of the evolved ones. Valerian says that someone who is Capricorn is someone who in previous lives has accomplished a lot in material terms and helped other people in material ways. And it gives them in this life a lot of ambition to make something of themselves in the eyes of the world. And it gives them a lot of self-reliance, the ability to rely on themselves. But that is where they tend to put their faith. It's harder than for the average person for a Capricorn to really surrender and be vulnerable to what they cannot touch. And although difficult, it's not impossible. And the Capricorn who succeeds in opening that Saturnian ring past knot of belief, Saturn rules Capricorn, accomplishes more than what other souls have to contend with. And a lot of spiritual teachers are actually Capricorns. But if I go to a party and I meet a guy and he asks me what I do for a living, and I say, well, I do astrology and tarot card readings. And he says, well, I'm a skeptic. I don't really believe in all that. I always go, oh, you must be a Capricorn. 9 times out of 10, I'm right. Yes, I am. How did you know? But last December, and actually people have been asking me to try to submit the last chapter of my book, because I talked about Pluto going into Capricorn back in 2004. And I said it's likely to kind of pull the rug out from under any tendency to be overly identified with concrete, material, financial reality for your security and your identity, and it's likely to wreak havoc with the world economy. Well, here we are. Pluto went into Capricorn on January 26th. Now, I said in my newsletter that Sagittarius is a feisty fire sign, and I didn't know Pluto's entry would be quite so dramatic. And I'd be watching.
Which would be November?
No, first time it went in January. Yeah. And
did it come back out?
yeah, then in June it went out again. But January 26th was a Saturday, and that morning all the talk shows was about the absolute miserable week on Wall Street the week before. That's when the whole dialogue shifted from the war to economy. Now, the reason that the United States would be such a big player in this financial meltdown is because we are born with Pluto in Capricorn. That's the last time Pluto was in Capricorn, in the 1700s. It takes 244 years for Pluto to go around the zodiac. Now, we won't get our Pluto return until some time. But you can feel how it's just going into Capricorn, it's just, it's bearing down on this need to really look at this. See, we have Pluto in Capricorn in the second house, the Taurus house of money and finances. That is why we are the richest nation in the history of the world, and the most materially obsessed nation in the history of the world. It's like the phrase, worshiping the almighty dollar. That only works here. You couldn't say worshiping the almighty British pound. People would laugh at you. Only here is money elevated to the level of worship. Now, this Pluto, see, and to understand the second house, it's useful to understand the sign Taurus. Valerian says that someone who is Taurus is someone who has in previous lives developed a quality of love at a very high level. They are ruled by Venus. Their challenge is to be able to give that love unconditionally. If they have a difficulty giving that love, they may instead turn back towards themselves, either focusing on their senses. A lot of Tauruses like chocolate, 5 main food groups, or an overvaluing of money and possessions and material security, which all the astrology books tell you about, but they don't tell you where it comes from. It's simply that love that when it can't go out, is trying to come back in. Interestingly, a lot of dictators are all Taurus. Saddam Hussein was a Taurus. Hitler was on the cusp of Taurus. Lenin was a Taurus. Emperor Hirohito in Japan in World War II was a Taurus. And they must have a quality of love or they couldn't inspire their followers like that. Well, they have this problem with desiring possessions, like other people's countries. I want Kuwait. Should give them more chocolate. So, it's like if you read about Pluto in the second house in Howard Mortis's book, it's like a list of a lot of the psychological neuroses of the American psyche, connecting sex and money and power and insecurity about your wealth. Like Americans buy way more insurance than any country in the world. And it's all this angst around material well-being.
Overpackaged stuff.
Right. And the Pluto is opposite Mercury. Now there's 2 factors in the chart that would indicate our mental thinking functioning. One is this Mars in Gemini, which in positive aspect is a very powerful mental energy. Trying to that Aquarian moon, it's all that powerful mental energy in the service of that Aquarian idealism, manifesting as the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. But the other is always Mercury, which represents your rational thinking function. And in Cancer is a watery, emotional sign. It's not a great place for Mercury. It's where your emotions affect your thinking, and you try to use your thinking to figure out your emotions, and it creates a blurring of the mental, rational thinking identity. And that's why we just can't figure it out. What to do with this intense Plutonian karma around wealth and money. See, Valerian has a book called The Nations, where it tells the personal karma and lesson and possible destiny of 25 different countries in the world. And as usual, he does not pull any punches. Every country has lost her something, some quality she once had. The only country in that book which has not lost some positive quality of herself is Tibet. Tibet has lost her body, her physical body. But that's all. She hasn't lost her greatness, her compassion, her sanity, her majesty. America has lost her generosity. She was once a country that did care about those less fortunate than her, and allowed poor immigrants to come here to build a new life, and not just immigrants with tech skills. She helped to rebuild Europe after World War II with the Marshall. But now a blindness has crept into the American mentality, and she's closed her doors to those less fortunate than her. Some interesting statistics. The majority of Americans in a poll, well, first of all, of the developed nations of the world, per capita, the United States gives the lowest amount of foreign aid per capita. 50% of what we give is military aid. The majority of Americans feel that we give too much foreign aid. When they are asked how much do you think would be appropriate, the amount they state is 2 to 6 times more than what we actually give. It's a total blindness and misconception. Another interesting statistic, the average CEO in a Japanese corporation makes 16 times more than the average worker. The average CEO in a German corporation makes 22 times more than the average worker. The average CEO in an American corporation makes 410 times more than the average worker. This is sick. This is insane. This is Plutonian obsession around power and money. And, and even insensible people are saying, this is going to change because it's forcing a lot of CEOs to just go for short-term gains to prove they're worth all that insane money, instead of really making long-range plans and so on. And no wonder those guys do the most blurred mental thinking, underhanded Plutonian manipulations when they start losing their stock value. Another little interesting statistic. As I said, it takes Pluto 244 years to go around the zodiac. Guess what happened when Pluto was in exact opposition to natal Pluto in the House of Money? The Great Depression. Yep. Put a little fear of the Lord in it. And people blame the Great Depression and the stock market crash of 1929. But when I was writing about the Depression in my book, I found a great quote. I said the stock market crash of 1929 was really more akin to a patient who suffered a fatal heart attack, who also had terminal cancer. And the whole system was rotten. But what did the Depression do? It got rid of Hoover and the self-made man, Republican, and it brought in Roosevelt, who was an Aquarius, and it brought in the New Deal. See, because this Neptune is in positive aspect at both ends of that Pluto-Mercury opposition. So the potential to really bring in a quality of compassion and healing and sensitivity is there.
When did we lose our generosity? Can you see that happening?
It sort of comes and goes,
Yeah.
But
8 years ago?
Probably in 71 when Pluto squared Pluto.
Yeah, you're probably right.
I think, I don't know. It's hard to say.
When did Valerian write the book, of Nations?
In 81.
What was Obama's sign?
He's a Leo. We're going to get to that.
Okay, you said Roosevelt now.
Right. Okay, so anyway, this is one of the major events. This is Pluto going into Capricorn. And what it's about is that we need to really look at the way we live materially and where we find our security and identity on this planet. I mean, when I was writing about this last December, I was only vaguely aware of the approach of the subprime mortgage lending crisis. But another thing, one quick thing about that, when I wrote the first edition of my book, was when Enron was happening. So I did research on that. And the thing that amazed me in looking into the Enron story was not that those guys would be that selfish and greedy and manipulative and joking about the old ladies left in the cold in California because they manipulated the electricity market. Because they were in Houston, Texas, and they tend to be like that. But it was the level of collusion throughout the entire financial community that allowed them to get away with it that long. It's like they didn't care because they were all making money. Well, the subprime mortgage meltdown is the same story. It's like they all knew that these mortgages to people with no assets, no collateral, and with balloon payments that were coming 2 years later, and adjustable rate mortgages. There's no way these people could keep these houses. But one, with the credit default swaps, they had passed on the liability to other people. And two, they didn't care because when the housing market was hot, they just figured we'll just get the house back and sell it to somebody else. And they didn't care. And it was just, and they were all in competition to each other as to how easy they were going to make the mortgage requirements. It just got worse and worse and worse. And then they finally shot themselves in the foot. But this is why, see, and it's this American intense greed. It's like I have friends in Europe who are also working in the corporate world. And we can be sitting at a table, and all someone has to say is, my company has just come under American management. And you don't have to say another word. You know immediately what that means. That the atmosphere is going to become completely competitive and cutthroat, and you got to watch your back, and everybody's out for themselves, and they're going to downsize you, and you're going to lose your job just so they can raise the stock value, and it's like, this is what is going to change. See, in Europe they talk about trying to have socialism with a brain combined with capitalism with a heart. Because between Russia and the United States, the Europeans have witnessed socialism without a brain, and American capitalism has no heart. See, America is where corporations were first given legal status, where they have the rights of an individual, but they have no human conscience. Their total purpose is profit. And people can absolve their human conscience by surrendering that to that corporate entity and its purpose and motive. The Bechtel Corporation convinced the Bolivian government to privatize clean drinking water in Bolivia. And immediately the price of water doubled. And then the Bechtel Corporation tried to convince the Bolivian government to make collecting rainwater illegal because it was unfair competition. Now this is the level of Plutonian insanity around wealth, power, and money that this country is capable of coming up with. And Pluto going into Capricorn is not a good sign for that kind of fear-based greed. I mean, to my mind, to have a world where 1% of the population earns 57% of the income, while 1/3 of the world's population does not have clean drinking water, and the majority of the world's population is clueless of this reality, is going to change. this is what Pluto in Capricorn is going to do. And we can go with it gracefully and see a need to like really transform this. Or we can do it kicking and screaming. Now, before I get to talking about Barack Obama, I just want to jump ahead to the next really intense period hitting the U.S. chart. There is a chapter in my book called 2012 and the End of the Mayan Calendar. Now, I'm not an expert on the Mayan calendar, and Valerian doesn't say anything about it. He is the source that I personally really trust. I did speak to a Mayan priest from the Yucatan in Mexico, and I asked him what's going to happen on that day, December 21st, 2012. His answer was very interesting. But people have been asking me if I saw any astrological correlation to 2012. And I figured, well, I could certainly look in the ephemeris and see what's going on there. So I pull out my ephemeris and I'm looking and I'm going 2010, 11, oh my God. Oh, jeez, man, look at that. But you have to buy the book. Part of me wanted to be a stand-up comedian. Okay, so what I see is happening around that time period is very, very intense astrologically. However, the end of the Mayan calendar is the end of a 25,000-year cycle. So the configuration I'm looking at is not part of a cycle of that great of a time period. But it could be an astrological trigger to that larger transformation. In 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, in that period, there's going to be, I think, around, I forget how many, but 5 to 8 squares between the planet Uranus and the planet Pluto. Now, the last time Uranus was square to Pluto was in the 1930s, which was the rise of fascism in the world. But that was a waning square. That was the last square before coming down into a Pluto-Uranus conjunction, which was like a new moon. It was like a seed. That was the start of a whole new cycle. And there was a Pluto-Uranus conjunction in the 1960s. And that is the astrological signature of what we now refer to as the 60s.
The what?
The 60s. Because that's what did it. I mean, Pluto is deep, intense transformation from the underworld and death, rebirth of your instinctual nature and the sexual revolution. And Uranus is the eccentric, the revolutionary, the unconventional, and freedom from old patterns that have outlived their purpose. And those two planets joined up, and it just like, and it was really around the world. It was the student riots in Paris, the Russian tanks in Prague, the Cultural Revolution in China. It was on top of our Neptune, so we still had the best music. And those of us old enough to remember the 60s can attest it was a time of major transformation. I mean, things were changing so fast, and people were opening their consciousness to all kinds of new possibilities. That if I were to go back to the year 1970 and imagine where the world would be in the year 2008, it would be way further than this. And if we go slow, compared to how fast things were changing then. But now I look at this and I see that this Pluto-Uranus conjunction was like a new moon. It was like a seed. It was the start of a whole new cycle. And as that seed was being planted, it created all this rapid transformation in consciousness. And then those planets started to separate. And the energy got less intense. To my mind, relatively boring. But in 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, they square each other. And that's like the first quarter, it's the first crisis, the first test as to how well you've lived up to the vision in the seed. There was a lot of visions given in the 60s, but I think the Beatles summed it up. Love is all there is. In fact, the Mayan priest from the Yucatan, he said that on that day, December 21st, 2012, every person on the planet will have to choose. They can choose love, or they can choose fear. But they'll have to choose. Now, for the United States itself, this period is going to be mega intense. Pluto will still be moving through our first house of self-image, like I said, until 2018. It will have already been in opposition to our Venus and to our Jupiter, and it will be within 5 degrees of an exact opposition to our Sun, which really won't come until 2013. Uranus, which moves faster, will have moved from the sign of Pisces, where it is now, into the sign Aries. It will move from our third house of mind and thinking into our fourth house, the Cancer house of home and family and sanctuary and security and homeland security, and square Pluto and square our Sun. It'll be a T-square on our very Sun, our Cancer nature. Now what will this be? God only knows. I can envision 2 possible scenarios, one more fun than the other. On the one hand, there could be this Uranian eruption of really new, revolutionary new consciousness within our own homeland, of freedom of old patterns from the past, in conjunction with this total death rebirth of the way we see ourselves, and a liberation that we really are this potentially caring, nurturing, mothering Cancer nation. And Oprah gets elected president. Or it'll be nuclear bombing of all the major cities in America.
Oh, thanks.
Or something in between.
You mean like Palin getting in?
Yeah, that's a scary proposition. I mean, I had said, in some ways, I felt sorry. I didn't want Obama to win because I felt sorry for him having to deal with all that. But then the thought of McCain being in charge of all that intensity, it would definitely be nuclear war.
When did you, on this, like the time frame for that?
It's really between 2011 and 2014, 15, that whole period. Yeah.
Does polar shift, magnetic polar shift, enter into this at all? The planet is
Not that
black.
I'm aware of. So that's what's coming up. Now, one thing about our Sun in the 7th house is, Valerian says, that gives someone really high ideals in terms of relationship. But there can be a tendency to try to force the other person in the relationship to live up to your ideals as to how the relationship should function. The United States doesn't do that. They call the coalition in Iraq the coalition of the bribed and coerced.
Do you mind if I ask a question about Iraq in relation to general chart? So, obviously the Mars square Neptune must have been triggered by something in Iraq's chart, since there's such a dynamic going on, and maybe with Vietnam also. I was wondering, did you ever connect those dots?
Anyway, so that's, the major intense transformation. Now, one of the things that's going on behind the scenes that I feel really optimistic about is the progressed Sun of the United States. The progressed Sun I find to be one of the most useful indicators of the movement of identity and consciousness within the chart. And it's where you move the Sun 1 degree for every year of your life. the day after the election in 2004, the day after, see, the progressed sun stays in the same sign for 30 years. But the day after the 2004 Bush and Kerry election, it moved into the sign of Pisces. And I said, oh, I can feel that coming, no matter which way it goes. If Kerry wins, then all of us Democrats would feel like, you know, that we can become a more compassionate, Piscean, sensitive nation. And all the Republicans would feel like victims and martyrs. And if Bush wins, then all the evangelicals will be feeling that God has answered their prayers, and all of us will be feeling like victims and martyrs. That's the way it played out. But it is still slowly moving 1 degree for every year through the sign of Pisces, which means it's moving into harmonious aspects to our Cancer planet. It's like our identity is moving into positive relationship. It's like in the last few years in relationship to our Venus in Cancer. And soon to our Jupiter in Cancer, really this year, well, next year. And eventually it's going to move into a trine to our Sun in Cancer. So there's this potential that we really do reconnect. But now it may involve a big shakedown. You know, there could be some kind of civil war or conflict or tension with this Uranus in our home house of homeland. It's hard to say. But behind the scenes, there is this positive energy coming in. Now, Hilarion says, you see, one thing I can say about the United States, that one of the last chapters in the book, in the first edition, is a tarot card reading that I did for the United States of America at that lecture on September 12th, 2001. See, my specialty in my practice is combining tarot and astrology. Because to me, astrology shows what are the lessons and experiences your soul agreed to work on and grow through in this lifetime. And the transits and progressions show what's hitting you. But with astrology by itself, you can't see what you're doing with that or what growth you've reached having worked on that stuff for these many years already. And that's what I feel I can see in the cards. To me, the chart is the curriculum you signed up for in this life. The transits are your current exams, and the reading is your report cards. We can all relate to that analogy. And I normally do this Kabbalistic tree of life reading, which is a whole map of your soul, the psyche, spiritually, psychologically. Now, for the United States, I did my 1-hour Celtic Cross reading. And the only card I'm going to mention tonight was the outcome. The overall outcome of the whole cycle of events I was looking at in that reading. And it was a good card. But it might not sound like it. It was the devil. Which, interestingly, corresponds to the higher aspect of the astrological sign Capricorn. The devil is one of the so-called major arcana cards. The ones that have names like the Fool, the Magician, the Priestess, the Hanged Man. In the Kabbalistic system of the Tarot that I work with and study and teach, these are 22 pathways of initiation from one sphere of consciousness to another. And their true significance is as a transition in consciousness. And they're all necessary experiences in life. Some are more pleasant than others. The devil is the initiation, where you must face your own devil. That which blocks or limits you from being who you really are and can be. Seeing clearly the illusions that have been laid on to you by parents or society or past or present relationships that are not really true. Or it's only your belief in those illusions It gives them power over you. And the reason the devil is a good card is until you can see your devil, you can't do anything to get past it. But it is where you got to face the music and see what's true and not true about yourself. And with that, I can feel that in the end, America, the United States, is going to face the truth about itself. Now, obviously the big question is what it's going to take to make it do that. The rest of the material that Valerian presented in the book The Nations, after he said that America's lost its generosity, he said that during the years ahead, which is a period of time that he calls the tribulation, that we're kind of moving through now, which maybe I should give you a little short explanation. The tribulation, he says, is something that was set in motion 12,000 years ago, during the time of the destruction of Atlantis, when it was seen that humanity was not going to reach the basic goal of spiritual development within the amount of time that we have. And we only have so much time because the earth herself is a conscious being. And she is ready now to go into her next phase of evolution. But if she were to do that now, many people would find those higher frequency energies extremely uncomfortable, or they would use them in very negative and destructive ways. So there has to be this period of trial and tribulation to kind of separate the sheep from the goats, so to speak. So it's not a punishment in a fundamentalist Christian sense, but more of a final encouragement to people to change before it's too late. Valerian says there are three main groups of humanity right now. Those who are already of the light, who know the way life could be if we were just willing to live in peace and have faith in something beyond our own ego, who he says need have no fear. They will be guided to be where they need to be and when and with who, and all they need to do is to be willing to serve in whatever way they're capable. There's another group that's almost hopelessly lost in darkness. Almost nothing can be done to reach them. And then there's a very large middle group that can go either way. And it's the middle group they are the most concerned about. And he says through the efforts of light workers, more souls are being brought into the light than are being lost into the darkness. But we only have so much time. So this is what he says about the United States. America has lost her generosity. Blindness has crept into her mentality. And although she herself will be spared the onslaught of the tribulation until near the end, when she sees difficult destruction or chaos taking place elsewhere in the world, this blindness will come up. And she will once again come to the rescue of other nations and give of her wealth and her riches. And in the new age, she will be a great leader of truth and justice for all. And there are times where I start to lose faith in that prophecy, but I'm really happy to have heard it and try to maintain that faith. That this blindness will come off, and that just the ignorance and the unawareness, will come away, and that we really could be a new nation. And since November 4th, it's been a lot easier to feel this possibility. When I woke up on the morning of November 5th, I felt like I just woke up from an 8-year nightmare. Which brings us to the other major astrological event of 2008. And that is the fact that for the first time in 40 years, there was an exact opposition between the planet Saturn and the planet Uranus. Saturn is the status quo. Authority, duty, structure, limitation, responsibility, the conventional. Uranus is the unconventional. Sudden change out of the blue you wouldn't expect, the revolutionary, freedom from old patterns that have outlived their purpose. But the tension between those two planets did not peak, did not become exact until November 4th, election day, which for all us astrologers was like insane. Knowing that months ahead of time.
Validates your calling, your profession.
Yeah, so, I mean, it was insane. And obviously McCain would have been Saturn. You know, the oldest president willing to stay in Iraq for 100 years. You know? And Obama was Uranus, the unusual, the surprise, the out of the blue. Of course, what did Obama do? He put a little Saturn on his ticket with Joseph Biden. So what did McCain do? He put a little Uranus on his. It was which Saturn-Uranus ticket was going to win. Now, and obviously what occurred on that day was the old Saturn structure transformed, got liberated. You know, Uranus won out with the Saturn. However, we are not out of the woods yet. There is going to be a total of 5 Uranus-Saturn oppositions over the next 2 years, which is, normally there's like 3 when this happens. It's going to be 5. And we're going to be hitting the U.S. chart very intensely. The initial Uranus-Saturn opposition was 19 degrees some minutes, which is technically the 20th degree of Virgo Pisces. The U.S. Mars is the 22nd degree of Gemini, which is square to Virgo in Pisces. And the Neptune is the 23rd degree of Virgo. So it was really close onto that. And that was, you know, until the economy came in, that was clearly the biggest difference between McCain and Obama, is how their approaches to the war, to this Mars-Neptune insanity. And McCain was the Saturn approach. Obama was Uranus. Now again, what we need is a healthy integration of these energies. Although I personally feel that Obama is more capable of embracing Saturn than McCain is of embracing Uranus. Sarah Palin doesn't cut it to be real change. But this Saturn-Uranus opposition, it hasn't really peaked yet on this Mars-Neptune. It does next year. Next year, although the next opposition is going to be around 24 degrees of Virgo Pisces in the fall sometime. So, which means next year they're both going to make exact squares, conjunctions, oppositions to this square.
Are you saying that that's around September?
I think it is. September, the next opposition.
Isn't it February? I'm pretty sure it's February 9 when they oppose for the second time.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, the second one is in, but I think that's also before the Mars-Neptune. And again in the fall. It hits it during the summer is when it really hits the Mars-Neptune. Not at the same time, but close enough. But again, looking at...
Does it fall off abruptly after the opposition?
I don't know if it falls off abruptly, you know, but it kind of builds and it peaks, and then it's intense, and then it mellows, and then it builds and it peaks. But this Uranus-Saturn opposition is very interesting when you look at the chart of Barack Obama, because there's 2 factors in this chart that to me indicate why he is the man of the hour in terms of what is needed now. One is his Aquarius rising. according to Hilarion, gives a self-image. See, Aquarius is ruled by Uranus, the planet of the unusual, the different. All the planets rotate like this, except Uranus, it rotates like this. A total different spin. And Uranus and Aquarius rising gives a self-image that's open to the unusual and the different and the unconventional, being able to think outside the box. But ironically, Hilarion says it's actually been given to someone because in previous lives they've had a tendency to be a little bit too conventional and kind of stuck in the rut of conventionality, and it's actually to help trip them out. And people with Aquarius rising will find periods of their life are really conventional, and you have to toe the line and do your duty and show up on time. And then periods are really bohemian and unconventional and different. And they have to find a balance between those extremes, which is like between Uranus and Saturn. Obama himself is having to deal with an integration of the Saturn-Uranus kind of energies within his own self-image of himself throughout his entire life. But this is also why, at times, Obama seems really progressive and really out there and really, sounds great to real left-wing progressives like myself. And then at times he says stuff or comes off with stuff that seems like really conventional and status quo and not very centrist, and it not very, doesn't make a lefty like me very happy. But I also realize, a lefty like me, there's no way they're going to become president. It's not going to happen. When you do the profile to see which candidate you really match up with, I always end up with Dennis Kucinich. He didn't have much chance. Although I have a funny thing about Dennis Kucinich, because he's a Libra, like myself. And it cracked me up that the first time he ran for president, he was single at that time, and it was kind of clear that he didn't have a chance. But then they ran a contest on his website where you could win a date with Dennis Kucinich. And I was thinking, that's so Libra. You can't make president, so you go for a hot date. And I found out now he's got a super hot new wife, and I was thinking, maybe I should run for president. But I personally feel that Obama just knows how to play the game. He knows how to have this openness to change, but how to be realistic about it to pull it off. That's what we need now. We need Uranus and Saturn. This theme is totally repeated in his chart by this Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. First of all, Saturn is contraction, Jupiter's expansion. He's already working at integrating those kinds of energies. But even though they're conjunct, they are in different signs. Jupiter is in Aquarius, adding to this Aquarian, Uranian theme. Hilarion says Jupiter in Aquarius in positive aspect gives one the ability to bring together conflicting groups and encourage the quality of love and brotherhood among them. Princess Diana had Jupiter in Aquarius. She had that great humanitarian energy.
So did Einstein.
And Einstein. But his Jupiter in Aquarius is conjunct Saturn in Capricorn, which is actually the sign ruled by Saturn. And it's actually a good place for Saturn. It's where you can put a lot of commitment and perseverance and dedication to whatever work or career or role you want to play in life. So he's got that combined Jupiter, Aquarian, humanitarian, visionary energy with that hard-working Saturn. And it's like Uranus, Saturn, bringing it together, keeping it together. It's in his 12th house, which has two levels of interpretation. Hilarion says the 12th house is a house representing the memory of the most recent past life. Now, for those of us who believe in reincarnation, clearly everybody has had whatever was their most recent past life. Not everybody has planets in the 12th house. Those who do are particularly being affected by it. And the nature of the planets and the nature of the aspects to those planets will give you clues to the nature of that life. Well, this is also a funny dichotomy. Jupiter in the 12th would indicate that the most recent past life was one where there was a lot of positive good luck and fortune, earned from previous lives of good karma, which will give one in this life an unconscious source of optimism, that somehow, no matter how bad life gets, life is all right. Saturn in the 12th house basically indicates that your last lifetime sucked, so to speak. That it was very difficult, that there was poverty or economic deprivation or emotional stress. So he's got that both. I mean, it could have been part of the life was one way and then it was the other or something. But there was like a mixture of those energies in his unconscious. Now, the second level of interpretation of the 12th house is interesting. See, I intend to, now take the time to read biographies about Obama and get some of the biographical details and do some writing about what I see in his chart. It's like in my book, I did a whole chapter on George W. Bush, which maybe I'll talk about that in a second. But the second level of interpretation of the 12th house is what I learned from Liz Green. When I studied with Liz Green, she said that she didn't know where she stood on the doctrine of reincarnation. And she says that the 12th house is what she calls the inherited family daemon, the inherited family unconscious that you get like programmed. My feeling over the years has evolved to I really believe that it's both. That you are carrying this past life memory, and then you incarnate in a family where that same kind of complex of energy is being carried in the unconscious. And I can feel, from what I've been able to see already in my studies about Obama's life, this really feels like his mother, who had this Jupiter in Aquarius openness to humanity. I've noticed a lot of, particularly women, who are in interracial marriages of Jupiter in Aquarius. They have this outside of the box, we're all one human family quality of sharing and togetherness. And obviously her mother had that. I mean, to be in an interracial marriage in 1961 was pretty outside the box. But in 1961, that Jupiter definitely came with some Saturn heaviness and limitation and restriction. Now, the actual relationship that she opened to in that Aquarian way also had its own Saturn heaviness and restriction, especially in the fact that it only lasted a couple of years. And then she virtually didn't see it. And this does bring in another big major factor in terms of an insight into who Barack Obama is as a person and what he's dealing with himself that is affecting who our new president is and how he's likely to react to things. And what I want to look at now is the fact that he is a Leo. But his sun in Leo is square to Neptune. Now personally, I like the fact that he is a Leo. George W. Bush has Leo rising, which means he's a fake Leo. so to speak. See, Leo rising gives a self-image that has Leo qualities. A certain pride, a certain elegance, a tinge of arrogance or superiority. But, according to Larian, it's actually been given to someone because in previous lives they have had difficulty feeling good about themselves. It's actually to help boost them up. And you can see that in George W. Bush. He's really insecure. He's a Cancer. He's a mushy Cancer. That's who he really is. He thinks he's a Leo. Al Gore also has Leo rising, who both did. That's why they hated each other so much, because they're both faking it. Sarah Palin has Leo rising. That was so scary when she was being interviewed the first time, and they asked her if she felt any hesitation about being vice president and a heartbeat away from the presidency. She said, "No, I didn't even blink. You have to be wired for the job and ready for service." God, anybody human is going to blink. Knowing that she had Leo rising, it just scared the heck out of me. She said, "Oh man, this girl is making it." You know.
I wanted to go back a sec. You said that Obama was able to put together Uranus and Saturn because of that Jupiter-Saturn.
Yeah.
But I just wrote about his chart, and he has Uranus and Saturn quincunx each other within 1/20th of 1 degree. It's his highest aspect in his whole chart.
Right.
I wondered if you didn't think that had something to do with that as well.
Well, I mean, to me, a quincunx is like a mild irritation. You know, it's not a square in opposition, so it's not a tension, it's not a harmony. It's like a burr under the saddle. And so, and it kind of goes along with these other dichotomies. That's like, I would say, be like a third repetition of the theme. You know, Aquarius rising is where you go between Saturn, Uranus, Jupiter and Aquarius conjunct Saturn and Capricorn, and out of sign conjunction that you got to somehow get to work together. Is that theme, and that quincunx would also be that theme.
I see what you're saying.
You know, but like a mild irritation.
And also being biracial. It's
Well, we're getting
physical
to that. Yeah,
manifestation.
definitely, definitely. What's also interesting is Sarah Palin is an Aquarius who thinks she's a Leo. Obama is a Leo who thinks he's an Aquarius. That's kind of awesome. One last thing I want to say about George W. Bush, since pretty soon I won't really have much need to talk about him anymore. But I mean, people say that my chapter about George W. in my book, which is also on my website for free if you want to check it out without buying the book, you know, I dealt with him as a human, and I do see him as a human. See, George W. Bush is a reflection of ourselves. We are a Cancer nation that's out of touch with our Cancer nature and is obscured by these other factors. We think we're Sagittarius. We have Mars in the 7th house. George W. Bush is born July 6th. He's 2 degrees from the sun of the United States. But he thinks he's a Leo. He pretends he's in Aries. In his childhood, he had to be a Libra. So my rap on George W. Bush is where I use one incident out of his life where I can share 3 different reactions he had to the same situation. And it begs the question, which one is the true George W. Bush? The situation was the execution in Texas while he was governor of Carla Faye Tucker, a woman who in her early youth created a horrible drug-induced murder. Was on death row, but while she was in prison, she found religion. She became transformed into virtually a saintly person. And she wanted her life to be spared so that she could remain in prison and counsel young women who had fallen into crime through drugs and so on. And she had appeals on her behalf going all the way from the evangelicals in Texas all the way up to the Pope himself to spare her life. Now, I can share with you now 3 different reactions he had as to how he dealt with that situation. One was in his book, his autobiography, George W. Bush, A Charge to Keep. A Charge to Keep. To keep. A charge to keep. It was a hard one to read. See, he has a Libra moon and square to his Cancer sun. And Hilarion says a Libra moon in difficult aspect is a childhood where there's an appearance of calmness on the surface, but underneath it is not. And emotions are like stuck. It's kind of that cold, rational, airy mental energy. You can sort of imagine his home life might have been a bit like that. So in his book, A Charge to Keep, he just said in a cruel, rational way that, my hands were tied, there was nothing I could do, that was the laws of Texas, and she had done the crime, and so she had to do the punishment, and I was really out of my hands. One reaction. Second reaction. A reporter asked George W. Bush during that time period if he had heard what Carla Faye Tucker said to Larry King when Larry King asked her what she would say to Governor Bush if she had the opportunity to do so. Now, admittedly, George W. Bush thought that his comments were off the record. But what he said in a mocking, whimpering voice was, "Please don't kill me." So that was the second reaction. The third one was shared by Laura Bush in a biography about her, where she said during that whole time period, he was totally tormented, and he could not sleep at night. He was an emotional wreck over whether he should spare her life or not. Which one is the true George W. Bush? The cool, rational, that was the Libra moon. The mocking arrogance, that was the Leo rising. The emotional tormented was the Cancer sun. That's who he really is.
The Libra moon, he couldn't decide. That's what he did.
So, Barack Obama is a real Leo. And I like a Leo as a president. Bill Clinton, probably some others. See, someone who is Leo is someone who in some previous lifetime came to the rescue of a group of people through an act of leadership and courage, without which those people would have perished. And as a reward for that, they are given in this life an additional energy, physically, mentally, emotionally, and an image of themselves at the head of or leading other people. So they are like born leaders.
There was something coming across through email a while ago, and unfortunately I lost it before I could send it out to people, that it's a channel that Barack Obama was the reincarnation of Akhenaten, who was the pharaoh that brought the people together under one god, and previously had been the pantheon of gods. And that was so appropriate, if it was true, to his leadership now bringing people together with Aquarius rising.
I've also heard he's the reincarnation of Lincoln. He was an Aquarius.
With Capricorn rising, so it matches the 12th house.
Okay. So anyway, so someone who is a Leo is a born leader. The danger is that this extra energy can get attached to their ego and create a little pride and self-aggrandizement. You need to cultivate the other potential quality of Leo, which is kindness. Well, Hilarion points out that even kind Leos could think that the world is a play in which they are the principal actor and everything revolves around them. Has anyone heard of Bill Clinton? All about me, Monica. Now, Barack Obama's sun in Leo, however, is square to Neptune. And Hilarion says when you have the sun, which tends to represent father principle, square to Neptune, there's going to be some kind of quality that I would call Neptunian illusion, confusion, delusion, victimhood, and martyrdom involved in your relationship with your father. Well, we all know enough of the story that Barack Obama's father was a black Kenyan African, married to a white mother from Kansas. But they only stayed together a couple of years. And he was like out of the picture. Never saw him again until he was 10. And yet his legacy was always present because he grew up in a pretty white world, but he had black skin. And there was always this wooziness. And then when his father came back, he was kind of authoritarian and didn't approve of him watching television. He should be doing his homework instead. And then he went back to Africa and died in an accident, I think when he was about 14, and they never saw him again. But this wooziness, this illusion, confusion, delusion, victimhood, and martyrdom around your father inherited being is why Barack Obama is a much more humble.
Because you wrote that book, Dreams of My Father?
Dreams of My Father, reading to us, yes. But what's also interesting is George W. Bush has Sun squared Neptune, a little illusion, confusion, delusion, victimhood, martyrdom involving his relationship with his father. And I wrote about that quite a bit in the book. And one of the wooziest things I heard him ever say was when he was interviewed by Bob Woodward, and he from the Washington Post, and he asked him if he had gone to his father for advice for the war in Iraq. Pretty logical question. His father was at war with the same guy before and had been president before. And he said, well, actually, there's a higher father I go to for strength. Ooh, creepy answer to that question, you know. And it's this same kind of complex of energy. Sarah Palin has Sun squared Neptune. You see, whenever you have a difficult Neptune aspect, like the United States does, it will tend to create what I call a victimizer program. Where if you do not want to be a victim, you've got to be a victimizer. If you don't want to be a victimizer, you have to be a victim. And there's no way out. Except one. There's only one way out. There's only one way out of it. And that is the positive side of the planet Neptune, which is unconditional love for yourself and for others. Total forgiveness for yourself and for others. And spiritual faith, trust, and surrender to where there are no victims or victimizers. Just all us frightened little boys and girls doing the best we can. Now, Obama did have his angry phase. You know, when he was a teenager and he was into drugs and wearing black leather jackets and is trying to deal with his racial heritage. But I think he has come a long ways of really healing this victimizer program and developing qualities of compassion, much more than Sarah Palin or George W. Bush. But you can see how this theme pops up in his life again. For example, Jeremiah Wright, who was like a father figure, who has his own victimizer program going, who Obama did not want to victimize. You know, he was like family. He didn't want to go there until he got victimized by Jeremiah Wright. Jesse Jackson, caught surreptitiously victimizing him on a microphone. But what was the cause of his critical anger, resentment towards Obama? Critical statements Obama had made about black fathers on Father's Day. Is that a theme here? Repeated. Now the Neptune is in his 9th house of philosophy, religion, belief system. And this is why he also gets challenged on his faith, about his faith, by the fanatical faith of those who enjoy attacking anyone who doesn't share their faith. And he's got to rise above this. He's got to maintain compassion. But it's also like keeps him, his Leo-ness humble.
Seems to me he's in service to dissolving the boundaries between faiths. And that's he's triggering on a subliminal level.
Right, and that's also part of his unconscious programming in his childhood, to be an American but living in Indonesia and dealing with all of that.
Carl Jung had Sun square Neptune, and he had a lot of similar things.
Right. See, he didn't even know he was black till he was like 9. He didn't know there was any big deal about it. Until he saw some ad in a magazine, and it was somehow an issue, and he asked his mother about that. It was there in the unconscious, but he was like kind of oblivious to it. Now, on Inauguration Day, there's going to be, is it Mercury, Sun, and Jupiter all conjunct in Aquarius? The day of the inauguration, all conjuncting his Jupiter in Aquarius. And you can just feel that it's going to be a great day. Some people are concerned about this chart because it has a void of course moon where you shouldn't do anything new. In the last degrees of Scorpio, the sign of death, rebirth. And if they wait 20 minutes till it goes into Sagittarius, it'll be a lot better. But I largely see that Aquarian line up there as being like really positive. And there's something else that's like on the moon of the United States. I think it's Neptune. And so, I wish I could be in Washington. Right. Now, there are things in Obama's chart coming up next year that have me concerned. He has 2 things in his chart the same as Princess Diana. One, and they're both getting hit by hard aspect from outer planets next year. One has already been happening this year. One is this Mars in the 8th house. That's what Diana had, Mars in the 8th house, which is the Scorpio house of sex, birth, and death. And Uranus has already been in opposition to her. And which I think has thus far mostly been really messing with his sex life. He hasn't been home very much. His Mars is in Virgo, trying to this hard-working Saturn in Capricorn. And that's why, he really likes to look at all the details, and he can deal with different opinions, but still hold his Saturnian view of it. Like he says in his cabinet, he wants people with different opinions. Instead of just a group think like Bush was creating, where everybody thought the same way. There's no way to think outside of that. And he has the ability to hang in with that. But this Uranus opposing that Mars is where he's continually being hit by curveballs in the last year, with those Mars and Virgo energy. And with the economy and what to do with that, and Jeremiah Wright popping up in this, and all these things. But next year, Saturn is going to go over that Mars, while the Uranus is opposing it. Which, that Mars is conjunct exactly the Neptune of the United States, and is square to the Mars in Gemini. And Uranus-Saturn will be triggering that Mars-Neptune square. Now, I am not at all predicting that he will be harmed. But there are things indicating where you have to question if there's the possibility. See, the other thing that's hitting his chart, that he has the same as Princess Diana. He has Venus in the 5th house. And Larian says that Venus in the 5th house is someone who in previous lives has not put enough attention or energy into the relationship with parents and or children. Instead, it was all put into love relationship. And in order to rectify that, you are given in this life, either as a parent or as a child, a soul who will elicit deep love feelings from you. And this is normally a soul whom you have loved as a mate in previous lives. But by both of you being in a situation where you can't explore that kind of love, it forces both of you to explore these other avenues of affection. Now, looking at Princess Diana, it's also interesting to note that Prince William also has Venus in the 5th house, within 2 degrees of hers in Taurus. And it's as a parent or as a child, and clearly they were soulmates. You know, he's the charismatic equal to her. He has her height, her looks, and they both have their Venuses square and opposite to Uranus, which is accidents, sudden ruptures, and changes in that relationship. Next, Obama's Pluto has for some time, probably around the time of his speech at the election, or shortly after, it went in at the convention in 2004, where he really entered the scene. Pluto's been in his 11th house, which again has levels of interpretation, but in this regard, it's clearly his relationship to humanity, to society, to the collective. And he is playing this Plutonian role in relationship to humanity, of death, rebirth, transformation. That Pluto is going to be exactly opposite 3 times next year to his Venus. I am certainly hoping the easiest call on that is that it's already, you can see he's already been feeling it, is the intensity of this Plutonian relationship to humanity upon his relationship with his children. And they will be the first black family in the White House that was built by slaves. And just the intensity of that is enough to fit this opposition. But the thing that scares me is that in November next year, November 15th, there's going to be a Saturn-Pluto square. Saturn in Libra, Pluto in Capricorn. At 1 degree some minutes. Saturn will be conjunct to the midheaven of the United States. Pluto will be square to the midheaven of the United States at the same time. And this Libra midheaven is something I didn't write about in my book, because what I have to say about it is a little obscure and it's easier to explain it in person, my sense of it. Libra on the midheaven is a projected image to the world that has an emotional calmness and control. That is given to someone because in previous lives they've had difficulty controlling their emotions. They're like sleeping volcanoes that seem calm and mellow until they explode. And Princess Diana also had Libra on the midheaven. She was like shy Di, even though she was an emotional wreck behind that calm appearance. And this is the way I kind of sense this in America's experience of itself. See, I lived in Europe for about 5 years. I often say that I feel there's two things that enabled me to write this book. One is my astrological knowledge, and the other is the fact that I lived out of the country for a long time, to where you look back and you realize the whole world isn't like that. This is distinctly American characteristics. And I observed during my time in Europe that compared to other nations, you see, in Europe and other nations, they have a basic sense of identity and security that comes just from being a member of that nation. You know, they get a sense of belonging to the same club. They also are always interacting with other clubs, other nations, which strengthens your identity. Whereas America is so big, and there's so many different trips, and we're so mobile, there's so many different fractions, that we don't have a basic sense of security and identity that comes just from being American. And you can really see it to a lot of average Americans when they travel overseas on their 2-week vacation once in their life outside the boundaries of America, you know, where they don't speak English. And of course they cover it up with self-righteous Sagittarian. Do you speak English? You know, but you can see they're freaked. You know, they're really insecure to be just not at ease within their skin. You know, being Americans in relationship to the rest of the world. Well, Pluto has been, you know, moved close into squaring that midheaven already, and I think it's this. You know, it's one thing that we like create wars that we don't care what anybody else thinks about, but the fact that we are pulling the plug on the whole world economy because of our greed and stupidity is making it a little hard for us to just be cool, calm, and collected in the relation to the world. But Pluto and Saturn hitting that at the same time, I don't know what that's going to be. It's pretty intense.
Is that November 15th?
Yeah, I believe that's the date. Now, the thing that really freaks me.
Wait, didn't you say we should have to choose between love and fear? No, just kidding.
It's always that. But, well, you got to have faith that everything happens for a reason. As I tell my clients, if I didn't have faith that there really is a God or a higher reality behind life, and a reason why things happen, no matter how seemingly painful and difficult, it's really there to help us to grow or learn or balance past karma that we all have. If I didn't have that faith, I couldn't do the work I do. It would be too depressing. The stuff I have to look at every day, or I have to get professional enough, which is no fun either. But because my own life has been such a mess that I have faith. Another little thing I often share is that Hilarion says you cannot judge the evolution of a soul by the apparent conditions of their life. Because a lifetime that seems very difficult and very afflicted could actually be a very evolved soul who has purposely agreed to work on all or most of the remaining karma in one lifetime. Now, I've always said maybe that's why my life is such a mess. I'm really an evolved soul working on all my karma. I deserve a medal. I should be commended. Can use it for a boost. Anything for a boost. Joseph Biden. You see, I knew that the Democrat was going to win the presidency pretty much last December. Because there's a radio show in San Francisco called Seeing Beyond, which has a website. Yeah. And they always ask me to, in December, submit my predictions for the year, and they put it up on their website. And I'm not really super big on specific predictions, you know. It's like they say, astrology is archetypically precise, but predictively it's not. You know, there's different ways these things can play out, even though you can see the archetypal energies involved. But nonetheless, I was looking at the fact that there were 10 semi-viable candidates for presidency last December. And And I was looking at and thinking of looking at all those astrology charts and going, man, that is too much work. I'm not going to look at all those charts. I'm going to wait till it's not so many. But I thought I could do a quick thing. So what I did was I cut a tarot card for 10 candidates, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, asking how each one would be feeling the day after the election. Little tricky way to take an insight into it. And I could see the Democrats were definitely feeling more cheery than the Republicans. So at that time I felt, but I did say that it wasn't necessarily the indicator of who would be president. Because based on the results, the best ticket would have been Joseph Biden as president and John Edwards as vice president. Joseph Biden got the best card, the priestess, corresponding to the moon. She is the goddess of the moon, the full moon, the perfect reception, reflection of the spiritual life. And that was when it didn't seem like he was a real player. I had no idea he was going to be vice president. John Edwards got the Six of Cups, pleasure, emotional harmony and balance, but I figured that guy's feeling good just knowing it could have been way worse. I'm so glad they didn't pick me.
That's true.
But in looking at Joseph Biden, out of the George W. Bush, John McCain, Sarah Palin, and Barack Obama, he's the only one who has Neptune in only positive aspect. He has no hard aspects on his Neptune. It's trine and sextile to these other planets. It's in his 10th house, Capricorn house of work, career, role in the world. But it's 1 degree, 31 minutes Libra. Next November, when Pluto is in exact opposition to Obama's Venus, and Saturn is squaring it, and Saturn is on top of the Libra midheaven of the United States, and Pluto is squaring it. Joseph Biden is going to have Saturn on his Neptune and Pluto in his first house of self-image square to that Neptune. He's going to be dealing with some test of faith, of illusion, confusion, delusion, victimhood, and martyrdom in terms of his role in the world. I have no idea what that's going to involve. Now,
He'll take a bullet for Obama. I'm from Scranton. We can take a bullet.
or he becomes, I mean, you know, I hope it's not him becoming president through the martyrdom of Barack Obama. But Hilarion says that John Lennon purposely volunteered before he incarnated to be taken out of life violently, to create an emphasis for his message for peace. My feeling is that this could be, it's like how the United States deals with this Uranus, Saturn, on our victim-victimizer, Mars, Neptune, illusionary, violent tendencies. It's a test for the future of the world. If Obama is allowed to live, I feel we can transition into the New Age peacefully, that he has the charisma and the quality and the greatness of being and recognition around the world to pull that off. And if he's not, it doesn't bode well for the future. Joseph Biden's a great guy, but he's not the same. Now, I've only recently, it's like it hits a few times next year, these things, but November is when there's this simultaneous Saturn Pluto.
The 11-15 date, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. Now, see, it's interesting in looking at the red states. I'm happy that North Carolina is turned blue.
We got to.
But if you look at the red states, I mean, you got to notice the pattern. They are the southern states, whose history and legacy is slavery and the Civil War. And they're fighting to keep a race of people in slavery, and many of whom have never copped that there was really something wrong with them. My good friend from Alabama says that her father in Alabama would say to this day, they should have left things the way they were. Those people were happy then because they were taken care of. You've got to do a weird thing to your psyche. The other states are the prairie, mountain, Midwest states, which is where they created the hugest genocide of the Native Americans. So the phrase was coined, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and they delivered the blankets knowingly infected with smallpox. And those people have never copped that there was anything wrong with that. This is what fuels the Republican Party, which is basically based on greed and hate. People who don't want to give their money to people that might need it more than they do and want to have somebody to hate. And when that darkness gets so strong that it overcomes the 50% in the swing states, then we get 8 years of George Bush. And the thing is obviously even with Obama winning, the right wing is not giving it up. I mean, my friend works at the newspaper here in Asheville. And the day after the election, a woman who works at the newspaper, who's going to be a fairly intelligent person, cut out the picture of Obama in the paper and put it on the wall and drew horns on it and wrote Antichrist underneath it. And so if this darkness, this hatred, this is able to rise up to where they kill him. It's, well, the thing is that I'm encouraging people, it's like people have been saying we need to send light to Obama. And then one person said that, and we need to pray that any negativity will bounce back on them. I don't like that part. I think we need to send light to those people who are trapped in that kind of fear and insecurity and darkness. See, and this brings me to a teaching that I've been inspired to share as part of this talk. And it has to do with what is called the second enemy of a spiritual warrior. And this is from Carlos Castaneda and Don Roy. The first enemy is pretty obvious. It's fear. And that's what 98% of the charades and the pretense is about. People trying to pretend they're not afraid. With their looks, or their bank account, or their car, or their girlfriend, or, as it said in the t-shirt I saw in Hawaii, he who dies the most toys still dies. The second enemy of a spiritual warrior is much more subtle. But my understanding of it gives me a sense that it's just as much of a limitation on us being able to be all that the Creator intended us to be. You see, when you are no longer just ruled by that kind of base fear, you gain a certain awareness, a certain insight, a certain clarity. The second enemy of a spiritual warrior is clarity. Clarity. And this is the way I understand it. When you have this awareness, this insight, this clarity, when you can then see absolutely clearly into everybody else's BS. The thing is, what are you going to do with that clarity? Are you going to live in judgment and criticism and bear the literal burden of being superior to everybody?
Yes. No, I'm just kidding.
Or do you move through to the next level? To unconditional love and compassion and spirituality and faith and trust and surrender, to where there's no victims or victimizers, just all us frightened little boys and girls doing the best we can. And in my observation, 99.9% of the alternative culture, myself definitely included, is totally trapped in their clarity. But those few moments when I finish a 10-day meditation retreat, I get really clear of my smaller self. You know, I just see how that's such a puny place to be. And it's still judgmental, it's still we and they, and it's not this sense of awareness that we are. And those people require our compassion more than our derision. I still can't listen to Rush Limbaugh more than 10 minutes. I'm humanly, still frail in my depth of consciousness. But at least I do know where we need to go. See, we are responsible for our part. It's like what these people do, we don't have an intimate connection to unless your cousin listens to Rush Limbaugh and is a member of the Aryan Nations or something. But we have to add to the love and the peace and not the anger and the resentment and the criticism. See, sometimes I say that this Sagittarius rising that we have of being honest, upright, and morally strong, whether true or not, I hate to tell you it's not limited to the right way. We're all pretty obnoxious. Ralph Nader kind of epitomizes it to me. And I voted for Nader when it was Bush Clinton and Dole, because I could make a protest vote. But when it was Gore and Bush, it was too close. And when he went against Kerry and said he didn't think he was going to hurt the Democrats, he thought more Republicans would vote for him because they disagree with Bush's lack of fiscal responsibility. Oh yeah, Ralph, I know hundreds of Republicans who are going to vote for you. So these are all things that we do need to look at. But, I do try to keep the faith, and we got to do our best and let Great Spirit do the rest. If Obama were to die, it would definitely pull the rug out from under all that smarmy, arrogant criticism that would push America into its fight. My friend Kelly said that his vision is already out there, the message, and that we'll have roads going this way saying Martin Luther King and roads going this way going Barack Obama. But personally, I really hope we get to keep him for a little while. Because I think he can cope with this Pluto-Uranus T-square and keep us together and get through it. And he's got great things in his chart that give him that capacity. So let's just pray that the light will come through. So that's what I have to say.
I remember at the astrology conference in Denver when we did the debate on who the fellows that get elected, and it was, including Robert Hand, the high elected governor, it was unpredictable because there was, that Saturn Uranus was exact opposition. If we go either way, including George Bush may stay in office and stay and everything else. So it seems to me that there's an underlying rise in consciousness that we don't hear about from the media, we don't get it in a broader perspective, but we do have Sagittarius rising, and that is visionary, and that is breaking down boundaries between cultures, and I think that consciousness is really all that's left. And I myself have supreme faith, and that's what's going to override, even if Obama dies, it still can be
I have that faith too. Well, that's why I say the thing about John Lennon. Even if Obama dies, maybe that's the way we need to go for the lesson. I'll take questions, but let me make a quick commercial announcement. If anybody wants to sign up for my email newsletter, which I send out for free, there's a sign-up list. And I'm going to be here at the store doing readings through Sunday. And I have flyers that describe my readings and has my number where you can contact me if anybody wants. Okay. Yes.
In terms of the if Obama died, when JFK was assassinated, he had wanted to put through a civil rights agenda, but didn't feel like he had the political will to do it. It was when Johnson took over and said to Congress, "We got to do this for JFK in his memory."
Okay.
That's what got the civil rights legislation.
Right,
passed.
but that's
So-
also where they lost the South to the Republican Party.
Yeah, but it's just an illustration of how a great one can die and then a great thing can come out of
Lead to
that.
something positive, right. I mean, you gotta, like I said, you gotta have the faith. What happens needs to happen.
I have a question about going back between Bush and Gore when that election was taking place and we
Right.
went through all this. Who is it finally really wasn't ever elected? He was selected.
It was a coup by Supreme Court.
Exactly. There must have been something in his chart that sort of gave him the cake, so to speak, because it just fell in his lap. It wasn't that he was elected.
Well, yeah, but, I mean,
How did that happen?
You got it close enough. See, that's all the Republicans have to do is get it close enough and then they can steal it.
Well, I was thinking that perhaps it had some astrological impact.
You know, there's an astrologer, and what he does is, in order to determine who's going to win, he always does a synastry between the candidate's chart and the U.S. chart.
Yes.
Whoever has a stronger connection to the U.S. karmic curriculum. And he predicted Bush would win because his sun is 2 degrees from the sun of the United States.
Cancer.
Yeah. And again, to me, he is just this parallel reflection of where we're at. A Cancer that's out of touch with the fact that he's a Cancer. He thinks he's a Leo, pretends he's an Aries.
What about USA and karma and the atrocities that have gone on in such widespread and different individual little pockets that we don't know about, that we've never really heard about
Right.
in the mainstream media, and wondering if that can be
Well, you could go to a lot of
ameliorated,
places.
overridden.
You know, it's like this Pluto material power and manipulation. You know, is the corporate influence to government and so on. I mean, it's all a combination. When you see yourself as honest, upright, morally strong, whether true or not, you know, you can come up with beliefs like manifest destiny. That went over really well with the Native Americans.
So there's no way to undo that,
Well, you got-
that negativity that,
I mean,
that throws on.
Carl Jung said there is no hope for society beyond the consciousness of the individual. Until individuals develop a greater self-awareness and integrated consciousness, they're always going to be subject to mass hysteria, mass identifications with a group consciousness. I mean, this Pluto in Capricorn and shaking up the world economy is clearly, it's the way it is now is insane. I mean, the average American house is twice as big as it was 20 years ago, and it houses 1/2 as many people. And we have a housing crisis. You know, it's like, this is bizarre.
How long does that go on as far as the
Pluto in
financial
Capricorn
system?
is
Yes.
until 2024.
We must be in the strongest part now, or is it?
Oh, no.
No, it's not.
Now, when Pluto is still in Capricorn but square to Uranus, that's when it gets really intense.
And when will that be?
It really starts around the end of 2010 and it peaks around 13, 14.
Okay.
We'll do it back to the garden.
Possibly.
I was going to ask, I've been reading some things in some more radical websites that are predicting the actual collapse of the U.S. economic system in the next year or two. Do you see the
Yeah, well,
possibility of
I
that?
mean, I've had millennial fever since the 70s.
Well, not for 30 years or so since I was a
I mean, I live in the mountains of eastern Washington, 10 miles from the Canadian border, in a county that doesn't have a stoplight with solar panels and bulk food. And, you know, it's like I'm Y2K prepared.
My whole dream for decades has been that eventually there's going to be a big barn with us hippies in it, and nothing but seeds, and that was our wealth.
Right, right.
And I'm really afraid that's going to be coming true.
You know, I mean, it's hard to say. Again, if we can see the writing on the wall and make the transition. See, Hilarion says the oil in the Middle East was purposely arranged to be there. Knowing it could serve as a catalyst for a final war. Knowing the nations of the world would fight for ownership of the oil refineries. If McCain had won, that's definitely the way we'd be going. You know, all these oil companies just trying to be in there to cash in when the gas goes to $20 a gallon. Obama and pushing renewable resources and energy and just seeing the writing on the wall and not wanting to just be in a power, manipulation, control of the wealth of that oil is where we can avoid that fate. But I don't know if it's determined yet. I mean, Hilarion says the tribulation has to take place, but how severe depends on us. The way I refer to it is the world is going into a new birth. And there's no way they can stop it. The birth is going to happen. Now, on the way to that birth, into that new age, new consciousness, we're going to go through some labor pain. Now, whether it's going to be a 2-hour labor or a 24-hour labor or born cesarean or breech or with the quarter on the neck 3 times turning purple, that's up to us. You know? And it will be different in different parts of the world. You get this sense, especially from the book The Nation.
Do you have any information or any place to go for information on the natal chart of the state of Israel?
I do have, you can go online and search, Google search, but I've come up with a basic chart and a rectified chart. And they're both very interesting. One almost seems to be the legacy of Jewish people prior to the state of Israel, and the one with a little bit later time is like the new state of Israel. And I don't have that data now, but you can find it if you want to give me your email. I can email it to you.
I'm using Aries sign.
But they do say Israel is an Aries country. And it's interesting because Palestinians are Scorpio, which are the 2 signs ruled by Mars, the god of war. So they're both addicted to violence and aggression, but their styles are totally different. The Israeli Aries do it in 6 days wars and helicopter gunships and tanks. And the Scorpio Arabs do it in sneaky little suicide bombing attacks. And they totally hate each other's styles. Ariel Sharon is an Aries.
Hey, Steffan.
That's Aries and Germany.
Steffan,
England is Capricorn.
what's your website?
My website is spiritualcompany.com. It's also on the bottom of my flyer.
Yeah.
But that's my website if you want to go there and sign up for the email newsletter. You know, there's articles up there on the astrological Sarah Palin, the astrological John McCain.
We were talking, or we mentioned a while ago about peace and how McCain was connected to war, Obama to peace, because many of us wanted peace, but yet when I hear the predictions or in the chart as we head to 2012, it didn't sound like peace.
I know, and that's where I said I felt sorry that Obama would have to deal with that. I almost didn't want him to win.
I just want to be sure that I heard what I heard, because it didn't sound like peace.
It's going to be challenging. I don't know what it's going to be. It could be Oprah getting elected president. It could be a real Uranian eruption of new consciousness and the energy within our own homeland. Through some deep stress and challenge, maybe economic breakdown or something. Or it could be some like civil revolution, you know, violence or foreign violence in our homeland. Now you can see the archetypal energies, you know, especially when it's that far away. Like when I look at people's transits and their charts, you know, I usually look about a year ahead, because you can see how that's likely to affect things that are already in motion.